Please be seated. Our gospel reading is a string of short parables in the gospel according to Matthew. Jesus is speaking here. It's found in Matthew 13, verses 31 to 33, 44 to 48, and 52. So Matthew 13, beginning at verse 31. Listen to what the Spirit might speak into your life in these parables of Jesus. Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. And in his joy he goes and sells all that he has, and he buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great price, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea, and it caught fish of every kind. And when it was full, they drew it ashore and sat down and put the good in the baskets and threw out the bad. And he said to them, "Therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out of his treasury what is old and what is new." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Jesus has a poetic imagination. Have you ever noticed that? And in his poetic imagination, he depicts the eternal realm with just sort of a bombardment of images for this thing that he calls the kingdom. It's a tiny seed that becomes a bush where the birds can feed and shelter. It's a pinch of leavening, not yeast, but leavening. We'll get to the difference in a minute. Makes me crazy. It's a pinch of leavening that causes the whole loaf to rise. The kingdom is like treasure hidden in a field, so that when you happen upon it, you'd give everything just to have it. It's a pearl so perfect that you would sell all that you have and put yourself out of business just to own this perfect pearl. The secret now and coming rain is a net cast into the sea. It's a locked room, a treasury with old things and new things, wondrous things. This is the kind of writing that we kind of like in the 21st century, even if some of these images are maybe a bit outdated for us. Quick, simple word pictures, very Instagram style, not much text. Just enough concrete imagery to create a word picture, a mental snapshot. And the one thing that most of these parables have in common is that they represent the coming of God into our lives as a surprise event, as a secret element that will cost you plenty and change the entire plan. This is a hard message. For an orderly church, this is a hard message. We're not just organized religion around here, we are hyper-organized religion. We're very organized. We have got the book of order here. We've got the book of confessions. We've got lectionaries. We've got liturgies. We've got hymnals. We've got congregational bylaws. And if you thought the book of order was hard, we're hyper-organized religion. And in our sometimes OCD approach to organization, we hope that all of our systems and structures will serve the purposes of this inbreaking, mysterious, elusive kingdom. But do they always? Does it always? Our organization. This kingdom that surprises us, that offends us, that upends our plans and changes our plans, that turns up uninvited. Its coming changes everything. And that is what the kingdom of heaven is like. The short novel Silas Marner by George Eliot, it's set like most of George Eliot's books in the early 1800s, and it tells the story of a simple weaver, a cloth maker, named Silas. Now, Silas, when he was a young man, had belonged to a fundamentalist sect where he felt sort of emotionally abused. They excommunicate him and they shun him, and it leaves him distrustful of God and religion and people in general. And so he moves to a village in the country, and he sets up his weaving shop in a single one-room cottage, and he devotes his whole life to making cloth. Like the Lady of Shalott, he just sits there and makes cloth all day, every day. Now, this is not a criticism of small towns, but if you've ever lived in one, you might know that they're welcoming and they're friendly and they have good people, but sometimes it's hard to break into small town society. Sometimes they're a little wary of people who move in from the outside world because they don't know what you're doing there. And they don't know who your people were. And in fact, there's much talk about small town life these days because of some country singer who I'd never heard of called Jason Aldean and a song about small towns. Folks will treat you with courtesy, but they might hold you a little bit at arm's length until they figure you out. And that was the case for Silas. Not only was he reclusive, but people didn't know what to make of him. A man who lives by himself and makes cloth. What's he doing here? Why'd he come here? Why did he choose this place? Why doesn't he ever go to church? Because he never went to church. They don't know his story. And the novel is set in the 1830s when church-going was pretty much expected in England at that time, at least on Communion Sundays, which even for the Anglicans was only 4 times a year. 4 Sundays a year. Is it too much to ask? 4 Sundays a year. Just go to church. But Silas is done with church. He has seen the ugly side of church. He doesn't want to go to church. And so he leads a solitary life in his one-room cottage outside the village, just weaving cloth day by day. No friends, no hobbies, just him and his loom, which takes up most of the cottage. And because he's a bachelor who works all the time, he collects a pretty impressive stack of money. He's got a heap of gold, and he has nothing to spend it on. And he hides it under a brick in the floor of his cottage. And in the absence of friends, Silas comes to love his heap of gold, just like friends. There was no Netflix. And so every night after dinner, he would pull out his gold and he would stack it and watch it glinting in the candlelight. And he knew every nick and every coin on every coin. He knew his gold inside out. Maybe better than Netflix. One evening while he's out delivering cloth to a buyer, the drunken brother of the local squire, a rich man, breaks into his cottage, finds his gold, and steals it. The thief, who's rich himself, promptly falls into an old rock quarry and drowns because the gold is heavy and it weighed him right down to the bottom. And he won't be discovered until the quarry is drained 16 years later. In the meantime, Silas is devastated. Why would somebody steal from him? He's a poor weaver. He doesn't know who stole it, but what little faith he has left in humanity or in God is just ruined. I know this is getting a little long, but it's a great short book. You should read it. Shortly thereafter, a child shows up at his cottage, a 2-year-old girl. It turns out her mother was drunk and froze to death in the snow outside the cottage. And Silas says, I'm a lone soul, and so is this. I'm going to take in this little girl so that she doesn't have to go to an orphanage. And I'm going to raise her as my own. And this, at last, wins the hearts of everybody in the village. Suddenly, all the women in town are stopping by to make sure he knows how to care for a child. And people are stopping by to give him gifts of meat and children's clothing and candy and all kinds of things. And he names the little girl Epi after his 2-year-old sister who died when she was quite young many years ago. And the people of the town convinced Silas to get Epi baptized and to start bringing her to church. You can't have a little girl who doesn't go to church. And he does. And in that way, Epi rescues old Silas from his isolation and reintegrates him, or integrates him, into the community. And his faith in God and humanity is cautiously rekindled. He's rehabilitated by a little girl. Just one more twist in this story, then we're done. When Epi is 18, they drain the quarry, they find the thief's body, they find the gold, they return the gold to Silas, and the rich squire, the thief's brother, comes to Silas and Epi to confess a secret that he has been hiding for 18 years. Epi is his own illegitimate child, the child of this rich man. He's never had any other children, and so finally he wants to claim Epi and make her his heir. That happens a lot in those old Victorian novels, doesn't it? But Epi won't do it. She will not go to live in the big house. She adores the old man who rescued her from the orphanage and who stepped up when her own birth father did not have the courage to claim her. And she marries the squire's gardener and makes her husband move in with her and her beloved father, Silas. And they all live happily ever after. It's a long opening story, but a short novel. But isn't it too a parable of the kingdom? Isn't it too a parable? I know of no novelist, even in modern times, who gets into the psyche of humanity quite like George Eliot, who of course was not a George at all. She was a woman named Mary Ann Evans. Silas Marner tells of how one unwanted old man unexpectedly redeems one unwanted little girl, and then that unwanted life turns around and redeems the one who redeemed it. It's the treasure hidden in the field. It's the pinch of leavening, not yeast, but leavening, we'll get to it, that perfects the whole loaf. It's that one perfect pearl that you would give everything for and put yourself out of business. Maybe if you thought about it, you have something like that in your own life. The unexpected event, the unexpected person, the unexpected thing that found its way in and changed everything. The surprise element that made all the difference. And Jesus says it at least 4 times in this reading. That's what the kingdom of heaven is like. You know, here in Matthew 13, we see Jesus at his most poetic and most imaginative. He's spinning tales, metaphors, for what Matthew calls the kingdom of heaven and Mark calls the kingdom of God, but Matthew wanted to respect the Jewish customs of not using the word God too lightly, and so he makes it the kingdom of heaven. He's spinning tales, he's making metaphors. You know, traditional folk tales, they're meant to bedazzle you. They were the movies of the old days. And so they always had big things like castles and princesses and witches and dragons and weapons and wars bedazzling things. Not so with the stories of Jesus, which are also folk tales in a way. These simple stories that Jesus creates, they're filled with imagery from your life, well, the life of his hearers, less so our lives. We'll get to that too. They're filled with stuff that people knew. They're relatable. They talk about the stuff you know, and that was their power. Like the best poetry, they sounded an echo in the lives of the hearers, in the experience of the people who were listening. And so you could relate to them. You and me, these 2,000 some years later, it's harder to relate. Because for us, mustard comes in a bright yellow plastic bottle that you have to wash out and recycle. And for us, bread always has yeast in it. You'd only notice if it didn't. And us, we buy pearls off the Home Shopping Network if we buy them at all. Or if you're a classy old Pittsburgher, you go down to the Clark Building downtown to get your jewels. Some of this imagery from the first century in Palestine, it needs some unpacking for our day. Mustard was not a valued commodity in Jesus' time. It was a condiment that you would eat when you didn't have anything better. It was the kind of thing you would rip out of your field so you could plant more profitable crops. You wouldn't want it taking up precious space and water. But apparently the birds loved it, and so if you're going to grow mustard, your life would be filled with birdsong, but you wouldn't have much money. It had its value, but it wasn't the obvious value. And leavening in the Bible, they didn't have yeast in little packages yet. They took moldy bread from the last time, and they broke it up and sprinkled it into the dough. And that's how the dough raised. I guess sourdough is like that, maybe? The Herman cakes of the 1970s, those friendship cakes, nobody remembers those? Some people do remember those. I think it's the same concept. You keep a bit of wasted, rotting stuff from the last time and you drop it in this. But too much of it can cause food poisoning. And in the scriptures, leavening is always bad, isn't it? At Passover, you eat unleavened bread. And Jesus says elsewhere, beware the leaven of the scribes and the Pharisees. Leavening is considered a dirty thing. But all it takes is a little pinch and everything changes. And it works secretly. It does its wonders. Then there's this jeweler who's looking for pearls to sell, but finds one that he or she likes so much that they sell everything they have just to own it, just to keep it. Like Silas with his gold. And the farmhand who finds treasure in somebody else's fields and buys the field just to have that treasure. It costs him everything. The kingdom of heaven is like this, Jesus says. What does he mean? What does Jesus mean when he says that God's reign, God's arrival, God's presence in our lives is like something surprising, something unexpected that changes everything? What might that all-consuming kingdom, that reign with a G, R-E-I-G-N, what might that reign cost you if, with your shovel going about your daily work, you struck a treasure box in the field of your daily life? What might it cost us as a congregation in this newly secular age after the pandemic? Old habits, much loved, old ways of doing things, old ideas that were of what we're supposed to be about, how we're meant to live and work and do worship and mission. Old ways are not bad things, and they don't stand in the way of the kingdom necessarily, but could we trade them if we found just the right pearl, just the right prize? The kingdom of heaven is the unexpected thing that breaks into our otherwise good routines and reorders everything. It's invasive, evasive, hidden, all-consuming, a secret passion that unexpectedly overtakes everything in your life. It grows unplanned, unseen, perhaps unbidden, by stealth. But when you encounter it, you know it, and you'd give everything you've got for it. So, I have been slowly reading a book called The Pastor in a Secular Age by Andrew Root. Sounds like a great read, doesn't it? The Pastor in a Secular Age. And as with many books that I find a little dry, though he's a great writer, I frequently put it aside to read more entertaining things like Silas Marner. This slow book is supposed to tell me how to move forward in a time when religious institutions and all voluntary associations are kind of struggling. Involvement isn't what it used to be. And so this book takes a historical look at 5 famous pastors down through the ages of Christianity. 5 famous pastors. You probably know most of them. The first one is Augustine, St. Augustine, in ancient times. Second is Thomas Becket. Do you remember the priest who got murdered at the altar of Canterbury Cathedral in the Middle Ages? Thomas Becket. Then Jonathan Edwards. We all know him. He wears a great necktie. Jonathan Edwards, the Puritan preacher and revivalist from Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God that many of us read in high school. And then there's Henry Ward Beecher. He was an abolitionist in the 1800s. But who do you think the modern pastor is? It's not me, that's my only hint. It is Rick Warren. Rick Warren of the Purpose-Driven Life and the Purpose-Driven Church. And so he goes through it. In Augustine's ancient times, God was everywhere. God was all mixed up in everything. You stubbed your toe, you wondered if God was punishing you for your sins. There were devils everywhere too, and angels and saints. And you needed the church and you needed the pastor to protect you from those devils and to get you into heaven. And then by the Middle Ages, by Thomas Becket's times, God was still everywhere, and the saints and the angels and the devils were still everywhere. But the church was very powerful and very rich, and it controlled nations. And you needed the priest and the church to give you the body and blood of Christ, without which you would burn in hell for all of eternity. And then by Jonathan Edwards' day, colonial times here in America, the church was mostly about learning at the feet of a wise sage, a learned pastor, a teacher, who unlocked for you the kingdom of heaven. You forged your own relationship with God, but you needed a teacher to show you how. I think that's kind of where most Presbyterians sit today. And then by the 19th century, with Henry Ward Beecher, the abolitionist, he was a showman. And he was everybody's friend. He was theatrical. He was your buddy. He was your preacher buddy. You didn't need the preacher by that time, but he was friendly and he was fun. And so you kept coming back to see what he was up to. Church was all about relationships then, not getting out of hell. And then Rick Warren, well, poor Rick, bless his heart, he's essentially trying to make turnips sexy. He's essentially trying to repackage church for a consumerist culture that asks, what's the bottom line? What's in it for me? How can this make my life better? Because if it can't, I don't have time for it. God is not everywhere in our day. At least it doesn't seem like it. The preacher is just one voice among many. And sadly, we do not put on such a great show. Church is not for entertainment value. You are in control, and you're busy. And if you're going to devote time and money to an unfashionable thing like church, then you need to be convinced of the value that it will add to your life. And since most of us are not shuddering and hiding from all the devils that are all around us, and you don't need me to save you from your devils, I've got to add value. Church has to add value to your life. Now, I, for one, do not want to go back to the old days when Martin Luther threw an inkwell at the devil. Do you remember that? He really did. That's weird. I don't want to go back there. And I certainly don't want to be Henry Ward Beecher, because I'm not the life of the party. And I think I give probably no more thought to angels and devils than to Santa's elves. But somewhere along the way, we lost the deep conviction that God is very much tangled up in our lives. We lost the feeling that our living is a holy thing and a sacred thing, and something that God is deeply involved in. We lost the idea that there is something divine, something sacred in every moment of every hour and every day. We feel like God is something I might think about sometimes, or maybe that I stopped thinking about after confirmation, or maybe that I think about on Sunday mornings, but God is not a part of my daily life, such as God was through all these other ages in history. And yet, is God not intimately, invasively, sometimes meddlesomely, disruptively, surprisingly present in our day-to-day lives? Maybe not in the same way that we used to believe it, but does not each moment of our lives contain God's presence? Maybe think of it this way. Every moment, this very moment here, right now, it's kind of got three parts to it. Every moment, every minute, every instant kind of has three parts. It's got the past hanging over it, the past that shaped it and brought us this moment. So every moment's got a piece of the past, right? It's got the present. It's got you and me sitting here looking at each other a little blankly. It's got us here in this moment. It's got this present moment. But then the third piece it has is potential, is possibility, is imagination, is hope, is forward movement, is the life of God, is the possibility that God is. Every moment contains a piece of God's life right there in it, alongside the past and the present, calling us forward into tomorrow, bidding us do not be afraid, guiding us, holding us, helping us, giving us hope. This is God's presence in us, the vast store of possibilities that lie hidden like treasure in a field in every moment that we experience. And while most of us no longer assume that God is busy planning our days down to the second and to the minute with their chance encounters and their surprises, and most of us probably don't call on St. Anthony when we lose our car keys anymore because we don't feel like God is involved in the world in that way, and that understanding might be a thing of the past, God is still the possibility, present in every moment, calling us to do better, to be better, to heal, to grow. You never know what the next moment's going to hold, do you? Many of them are full of surprises, and this is the glory and the dismay of being human. This is its wonder, this is its fear, this is its beauty, this is its horror. We don't know what's coming next. We don't know. But God is the love and the life and the hope that keeps us going, that keeps us moving forward into tomorrow. And you don't know what that new moment is going to bring. It will surprise you. It will cost you. It will change everything. God's life is living in you and around you, holding you, guiding you, offering potential from one moment to the next. It comes as disruption. It comes as discovery. It comes unexpectedly. It's like a weed that overtakes your flower bed but then fills your life with birdsong. It's like a pinch of bitter leavening, smelly and awful, that causes everything to change and rise. It's like something of great beauty and great value that you just have to have, that you come across while you're going about the business of your life. And so what do these parables teach us? They teach us to expect to be surprised. Expect miracles. Be open to their changes, to their calling, to their cost. Because that kingdom, it comes to all people. It's coming to you. It's coming to me. That is what the kingdom of heaven is like. Amen.